It is something that was surprisingly open and liberal, okay? Because there were people who wanted to put democracy into South Vietnam. So we're going back again now. At the same time this is happening, they're preparing to have this election, to have this assembly that will write a constitution. The South Vietnamese continue to try to build the country, to go back into the countryside, right? And what are they focused on? They're focused on healthcare. They're focused on education. They're focused on helping women who having babies, right? And so these are some of the things. Go back like this a second ago. So they create the rural development program. They expand schools, and they start hiring women to be school teachers. All right. So again, you see this efforts for a country at war to implement social justice. Again, trying to build the country. They had managed to resettle 1 million refugees back into their homes or move them elsewhere. Again, the economy at the same time is tanking. So Key signs the first decree devaluing the piastre. It helps for a little while. But the U.S. had to keep feeding South Vietnam because so many peasants were either refugees or they couldn't work their farms because of the VC, and because farming methods, which we're going to talk about in a little while, were primitive in comparison to modern farming techniques. And I want you to remember what I just said, because in 3 years, 4 years from now, that's going to change dramatically. And it's going to change how South Vietnam looked dramatically. All right, so we have the Manila Conference, which we're skipping ahead a little bit here. And the decision was made to go back to what Tew had said back in July of 1965. We're going to change the combat roles. The U.S. will go out into the boondocks and fight the NVA. The ARVN will stay behind and guard the pacification teams. They will sit there and they will take care of the villages. And a smart division of responsibilities. Vietnamese talking to Vietnamese. You don't want Americans in the villages. It just gave the commies propaganda tools. And they did this because they thought they were finally starting to win. The tide of war had changed. This is a picture of the Manila Conference. All right. So, the Constitutional Assembly is elected in September of '66. They write a constitution, and this constitution is pretty interesting because for the first time in South Vietnamese history, you now had a legally binding document on the executive, right? So the president would hold most of the power because they wanted somebody who was strong that could lead the country, but not a dictator. So the assembly, the National Assembly, would be able to pass bills, they would have the budget, they would do a bunch of other things. But there's one key provision. No commies and no neutralists are allowed to vote or run for office. Other than that, it was a pretty liberal document. We're going to skip this, we're running out of time. All right, this is something critical. I want you to again remember these moments in South Vietnamese history that people don't know about. So on December 24th, day before Christmas Eve, 1966, Key signs, in my opinion, one of the most, if not the most important decree in South Vietnamese history. Which, again, we talk about these points in time where it could have gone either way, right? What he does is he signs a decree to restart elections at the village and hamlet level. Remember, we had elections for provincial council in May of '65. We had an election in September of 1966 for an assembly, right? But now we're going to go down to the local level to restore power back to where it had always been in Vietnam history, right? And so you see this slow march towards democracy. And these elections are now the third successful elections, free elections in South Vietnamese history. And we're going to skip some of this because we're running out of time. So the military, now they're going to hold a presidential election, September 67. Skip through some of this. They decided to put 2 at the top. We got some slides mixed up here, sorry. So now there's an election for the president and a National Assembly in September of 67, right? This is now the 4th successful national election in South Vietnamese history, right? More people vote in this election than in any election in South Vietnamese history, right? Thieu and Key win with 35, 34% of the vote, depending how you count. I'm sorry about this. Slides got mixed up. But nothing is ever simple in Vietnam. So they tried to, there were some people in the assembly, the old assembly, who tried to invalidate the vote. And they went to Win Cao Key and they said, listen, we will invalidate the vote. This will give you a chance to run by yourself. And if you run by yourself, we'll help you win. And then you can take over the country. Key was many things. But to his credit, he refused to do that. He refused to let these people invalidate this vote. And because he refused to do that, the House Election Committee validated the vote, and Thieu and Key became the first democratically elected government in the history of South Vietnam. All right? So again, I want you to think about these key moments in South Vietnamese history where it could have gone either way. Well, nothing is, I said, nothing is ever simple. So, to become the president, to lead the ticket, where Key would take over second, there was sort of a backroom deal among the generals. And the backroom deal was that, okay, Thieu, you can get to be president, but Key gets to pick the prime minister and the cabinet, right? So, this causes a huge blow-up between the two. It's the beginning of their eventual split. The ambassador Bunker begins to press Thieu very hard to, like, you know, here's a proposal to fix this and fix this. But Thieu sort of is a very cautious, slow movement kind of a guy. And he says to Bunker, listen, I'm the elected president. I have a constitution. I'm no longer a strong man. I can't just write a decree and make a law. I have to go work with the assembly. So Thieu, to his credit, wanted to take some time and figure all this out because it was brand new. The Americans and Key and a bunch of other people wanted to move very quickly, but Thieu wanted to take his time. I'm going to go in here. So then he finally seats his government, and just as that happens, just as Thieu was getting ready to launch his initiatives, the communists launched the 68 offensive, right? Now, this is what I want you to remember. So Le Duan in Hanoi had decided to launch the offensive because he thought, because of what happened with the Buddhists, that as soon as he attacked, the people in the cities will rise up, they will go for the communists, the RVN units will desert, because South Vietnam was this country falling to pieces, right? So what happens? The exact opposite. Instead of deserting, the RVN fought. Instead of going to the communists, people helped the RVN, right? And so what you have to remember here, even though South Vietnam's democracy was 6 months old, the people fought for it. And I want you to remember that, because that could have been a key turning point, but they didn't go to the communists. Much of this you guys know about. President Johnson announced a bombing halt. Le Duan, a typical communist, think he didn't lose in January, so he just has to keep attacking. So they launched another attack on May 5th. There is an announcement there's going to be Pea Stocks, so this is the beginning of May, right? And now I want to talk to you about another key moment in South Vietnamese history. As I told you earlier, there was a deal to put Thieu at the top of the ticket and Key would be number 2. And that deal was that there would be a very secret military council that would review all policy decisions, right? So even though there was a democracy in the front, behind the scenes there was a secret a group of generals who was supposedly going to control policy, right? So, and again, I want you to remember this. So, second attack, mini launches, Pea Stocks start. The generals and key come to Tew and say, listen, we can't have a democracy anymore. The country is going to fall. You need to get rid of the assembly. You need to rule as a strong man. It's Tew against all the generals. Tew stood his ground. He refused to give in to them. And one of the key moments, I think one of the absolute key moments in South Vietnamese history, the generals backed down, right? And from that point forward, South Vietnam's democracy took off because Tew stood his ground against a bunch of generals. He hires Chen Peng as prime minister, and then he begins to really move. And this, the People's Self-Defense Force, I think is the second most important program in his presidency. Because for years, people had said, well, the peasants we can't trust them, right? We don't know whose side they're on, right? Well, the Tet Offensive had just happened, and nobody had defected to the Viet Cong, right? So, Tew is now starting to think, he's now in charge, starting to think big term, right? Eventually the Americans are going to leave. We have this division of responsibility where the RVN are guarding the villages and the Americans are fighting out in the countryside, right? That's not going to last forever. The Americans are going to leave. What are we going to do, right? So here's his plan. We're going to arm the local people so that they can guard themselves. That moves the popular forces out of the village. That moves the regional forces into the province. And that means the RVN now can take over the main force war. All right? All right? So this is very, very important for two reasons. If you're not sure about who the people are loyal to, are you going to give them weapons? The answer is no. The generals didn't want to do it. Tew is the one that forced the issue. And what happened is that the people did not desert with those weapons or give them to the VC. So this is another instance where you see very clearly where the people's allegiance were. And the second thing is, by beginning this process of letting the Americans withdraw, you now have got to have a much bigger South Vietnamese military, which goes back to our earlier point. Who's going to pay for all those men and weapons and food and bandages, right? We just talked about this for a second. Go along here. All right, so talking about Pea Stocks, right? Pea Stocks are beginning to heat up. But Tew, for all his good points, had one bad point. And that is, his view was, we have to be unified. We have to appear strong. It's the only way we're going to convince Hanoi that they can't win the war. When Hanoi finally believes they can't win the war, that's when they'll finally negotiate. All right? And in Tew's mind, unity meant no dissent. Nobody calling for negotiations with the VC. Nobody calling for anything else. It's unified people. Skip through some of this. Please talk to you. We're going to skip through some of this. We're going to go through the 68 stuff. Sorry, I'm trying to speed up a little bit. Talk about, so Nixon comes in. We begin the process of Vietnamization. Again, this is the process of arming the South Vietnamese. Liam, I think you'll have the slides on the website, right? So people can look at these later, right?
Yeah, we will.
Okay, yeah. So, I'm moving forward a little bit quickly. So, this is another key moment, right? So, Nixon comes in, and he's trying to develop a policy for Vietnam. So Tew decides to help him with that. And so he starts to offer peace to NLF. We'll have elections. They'll be internationally monitored. We will respect the results. All you got to do is renounce violence and agreed to that you can't run as a communist, right? Every time he tries to offer peace to the VC, they reject it. So one of the things I want you to remember is that it's not that the South Vietnamese never tried to talk peace. They had defined their peace policies in June of '65. They had stayed with those peace policies until this time. Two had offered them on multiple occasions, and they rejected them every single time. Midway talked about this. And then he offers them again in July of '69, where, and again, the VC rejected. So, okay, Two is trying to stay ahead of the Americans. And so he says to Nixon at Midway, or when he comes to see him in Saigon, okay, here's my strategy for how the Americans can stay engaged, but not be here with so many troops. Withdraw your troops, keep a small force, right? Just give us the weapons so we can fight, train our people, and give us the money so that we can support ourselves. We'll do the rest, right? So Chu is trying to he's trying to give the Americans a policy that they can use to withdraw their forces, to lower the anti-war temperature in America, but to keep the Americans engaged, right? And it's called long haul, low cost, which means you can stay here for a very long time, but we'll take you from this high down to this high, reduce your costs, lower your casualties, and we'll take over the war. But he's afraid of one thing. He's afraid that if he does this publicly, that it will crack South Vietnamese morale, that he didn't think that the people were ready for this sort of thing, that they wouldn't have confidence in themselves. It's the one area where Chu makes a mistake. He doesn't, even though he had armed the people, even though they had rallied to the government side in Tet, he just didn't have the mindset that he had enough confidence in them. So he begins to think about creating a political party. And remember, South Vietnam only had the Dai Viets and the VNQDD, which were not national parties. They were very small, sort of regional based ones, right? But from now on, he begins to think of one thing and one thing only, and that is, okay, at some point, peace is going to come. It's not going to be a military victory. We're going to have elections with the communists, right? So we're going to win that election no matter what, right? So from here on out, everything he does is for one thing, and that is to prepare for an eventual election with the VC. All right. But South Vietnam is like going like this, but as I said before, nothing is ever easy. And what happens is a bunch of political scandals that would destroy most governments begin. The first one is spies are uncovered in the ballots, inflation begins to rise again, and there's a major change in economic policy. Because again, who's going to pay for all these new soldiers? But at the same time, he launches the Land of the Tiller program. And as I was explaining to somebody earlier today, I want you to think about this in this. In 3 years, South Vietnam gave away 2.5 million acres of free land. They paid the landowners for that land. They didn't steal it from them, they paid them for it, right? South Vietnam created a banking system so that the farmers could then take the money that the landlords deposited in the bank, borrow it from the banks, and go buy mechanical tillers, tractors, miracle rice, right? So you have a self-reinforcing system. And they did it without killing a single person, or having any mock trials or public denunciations. Compare that to what happened in North Vietnam in the 50s. 178,000 or so people killed. Mock trials, denunciations, killing the landlords. If there's ever a distinction between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, it is in how both people handle land. Farmer income soars. Miracle rice fertilizers, mechanical tillers. You then had people who were getting 2 tons on 1 acre of rice, 1 crop a year, going to 3 tons on 1 acre 3 times a year. Okay? Tripling the size of the rice. Sorry, I keep forgetting to go to the land ceremony in Cambodia. Cute little picture. Trying to change the economic system, right? The Americans have been pouring money into South Vietnam. Congress is beginning to complain about it. So they have to find a way to raise revenue, okay? You got to pay for all those new troops that you're going to replace the Americans with. The Vietnam armed forces have gone from 650,000 men to 1 million men in a year. You got to have money to pay all those soldiers, right? And this economic change is crucial. It collapses the black market, it stabilizes the piaster, and does some other things. We're going to skip some of this stuff. We're running out of time. But what happens is that just as the land-to-tiller program is passed, there are other groups in South Vietnamese society that had never been addressed. And the 2 big ones were the disabled veterans and the widows, right? They were sort of like an invisible people. And so as soon as the land-to-tiller passes, the disabled vets began to launch a protest. And Thieu had actually planned to change the pension laws, to give them more money. But it was going through the bureaucracy, going through the assembly again. He's having to negotiate with the assembly. But these guys launch a protest. At the same time, the students began to launch a protest, which was partially communist inspired. They take over the Cambodian embassy. Right? So we go through 1972, manages to placate the disabled vets. He crushes the students, right? And the invasion of Cambodia happens, which was very successful from South Vietnamese military perspective. So in early February '71, they decide to launch an attack into Laos, into the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? So we're going to talk about this for a second, and we're going to talk about the one-man presidential election, because from '67 to this point, South Vietnam is moving up. Land of the tiller is looking good. Society's more united. There's a democratically elected government. But this is the beginning of the end. The attack into Laos is a failure. And the Win Cao Ki decides to run for election in '71, and he tries to use it against Thieu. So Thieu, again, he's focused on one thing, an eventual election against the NLF. So what he wants to do is, he wants very much to have a majority president. He wants to be elected with more than 50% of the vote. And he's doing it because he wants to create this image of a strong country to convince the communists now is the time to negotiate. You're not going to win militarily, you're going to have to negotiate, right? But what he does is against democracy. So every election by the Constitution, the Assembly has to pass an election law, okay? This is how we're going to run the election, this is going to run, this is when we're going to have it, right? So what Thieu does is he goes into the Assembly and he bribes a bunch of legislators to change one of the clauses, right? Now to run for president, you have to either have 100 votes of the Assembly, or you got to have, 40 votes for the Assembly, or 100 people for the Presidential Council. And this causes Key and Min to withdraw, and leads to a one-man election, which crushes whatever prestige South Vietnam had left internationally, right? So those two things, the disaster in Laos in '71, which was a military disaster, which caused Hanoi to think that their people had, their military had rebounded from the 68 offensive, and the one-man election, which crushed South Vietnam's image domestically, is the beginning of the end of South Vietnam. This, I think, is one of the great losses in South Vietnam history. Thieu realized how bad it looked, the one-man election looked internationally. So he wanted to replace Prime Minister Kim with a civilian, the Minh Bong, a very respected man. He was going to give him almost complete control of the government, except for defense, ministry, and economics. He could control everything else. Bong is literally on his way to the palace to accept, and the VC blow his cards to him. It's one of those things where, again, we talk about these inflection points where South Vietnam could have gone this way or this way. I think his killing is one of the great tragedies in South Vietnam history. So, because of the failure of the 71 offensive, Hanoi attacks in March of 72, Thieu declares martial law. We're back to this whole issue of how do we rule the country? Are we going to be a democracy where the president has to work through the assembly? Or are we going to be a strong man who can just write a decree and make a change? Okay? So Thieu declares martial law by some manipulation to rule by decree for 6 months, and he changes a whole bunch of things. He begins to gut the democratic institutions that had been so painfully built over the last 4 years. And again, he's using his decree powers to prepare for peace, and he changes the political party law. He's trying to force the nationalists to unite politically. He wants them all to vote for one man, him. So he creates his own party, the Democracy Party. So the Paris Peace Accords are signed, and now he has to do two things. Now South Vietnamese is theoretically at peace, so now he's got to handle the peace, and he's also got to prepare for an election, because the Paris Peace Accords called for the building of a council that included the South Vietnam, the NLF, and the Third Force, these neutralists supposedly. Right? So they try to begin negotiations to create this council, to create this election. The NLF completely shuts him down because they wanted him to resign first. And they wanted to resign because they knew he was the force holding South Vietnam at bay. But the talks stall, fighting resumes. Thieu turns to fixing the economy and trying to resettle refugees and rebuild. So what had happened was there was so much physical destruction from the 72 offensive that the years that I call South Vietnam's golden years, March of 69 and the end of March of 72, when all this pacification happened in the countryside, building bridges, the farmers, healthcare, a lot of that got destroyed, right? So now the war is over, but he's got 1 million refugees to resettle. He's got thousands of wounded soldiers to take care of. The economy has been destroyed. There's tremendous physical destruction. 2 cities are in ruins. So now he's got to rebuild the country. He's got to resettle all these refugees, and he has to take care of all the wounded soldiers. So what does all of that take? Money. And what does he not have? Money. All right? So here we go. The budget deficit is soaring. Inflation is rising. People on fixed incomes are trying to buy a bag of rice that's gone from this amount of money to this amount of money in 3 months. So by the end of 73, heavy fighting resumed. The economy is a disaster. It's in a depression. Right? People begin to protest again about corruption. The Cao Dai, the Lao, the Montagnards all begin to seek their own accommodation with the VC. Right? So what you see now is South Vietnam starting to fracture. And why did Hanoi decide to attack? Because in their minds, again, South Vietnam looked weak. And they'd attacked in 65 and gotten beat. They'd attacked attacked in 68 and got beat. They attacked in 72 and got beat because they thought South Vietnam was weak each time and got their butts kicked. But now they're going to attack again, so I say they're wrong, they're right for all the wrong reasons. So they attack again. When Cao Ki comes back onto the political scene, he demands control of the military. She refuses.